In The Bold and the Beautiful, the most terrifying dangers are never announced with raised voices or obvious threats. They emerge quietly, wrapped in obligation, blood ties, and the kind of fear that turns love into a weapon. That was the reality Lee Finnegan stepped into the moment Sheila Carter summoned her without warning. The request was framed as a conversation, almost cordial, but Lee knew better. Sheila never spoke without intention, and she never reached out unless she already held leverage. The meeting itself felt like a trap before a single word was spoken. Sheila's calm was too precise, her posture too relaxed, as though she were already confident of the outcome. When she began to speak, she did not start with threats. She started with knowledge. She spoke of Deacon Sharp and Taylor Hayes, of the intimacy growing between them, of moments no one was supposed to see. Sheila's eyes sharpened as she described the relationship not as a romance, but as a betrayal of her, of fate, of the fragile balance she believed still existed. Then she shifted the conversation with surgical cruelty, bringing up the one name that could unravel Lee completely, John Finnegan. Sheila did not need to spell out the danger. The implication alone was enough. She made it clear that if Deacon and Taylor remained together, if that relationship was allowed to solidify, Finn's safety could no longer be guaranteed. The words were measured, not shouted, which made them far more horrifying. Lee felt the blood drain from her face as the truth settled in. Sheila was not asking for help. She was issuing an ultimatum. Either Lee cooperated in dismantling the relationship between Deacon and Taylor, or Finn would become collateral damage in a war he never chose. Lee had spent her life believing in control, in discipline, in the idea that knowledge and precision could prevent chaos. Sheila shattered that belief effortlessly. In that moment, Lee understood the kind of power Sheila wielded, not brute force, but psychological domination. Protecting Finn was not just Lee's instinct as a mother. It was the axis upon which her entire identity turned. And so, trembling with fear and rage she could not express, Lee agreed to cooperate. Not because she believed in Sheila's cause, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The plan Sheila outlined was deceptively simple. No violence, no direct confrontation, just misunderstandings carefully engineered to corrode trust. Sheila wanted Lee to create situations that would place Deacon and Taylor at odds, missed messages, misplaced information, moments that suggested betrayal where none existed. Lee was instructed to act as a neutral presence, a trusted professional whose involvement would never be questioned. The cruelty of the plan lay in its plausibility. Nothing overt, nothing illegal, just enough doubt to make love collapse under its own weight. Lee carried out the first steps with mechanical obedience, her actions hollow and detached. She altered schedules subtly, passed along incomplete information, allowed assumptions to take root without correcting them. Each small act felt like a betrayal of her ethics, of her profession, of herself. She told herself it was temporary, that once Finn was safe, she would find a way out. But the longer she participated, the more she realized how deeply Sheila's web was entangling her. It did not take long for others to notice that something was wrong. Lee's behavior shifted in ways she could not fully conceal. Her conversations grew guarded. Her eyes darted nervously. She flinched at sudden noises, checked her phone obsessively, spoke in fragments instead of certainty. Steffi Forrester, already attuned to danger after years of living in Sheila's orbit, felt her unease sharpen into suspicion. Finn noticed it too, though from a different angle. As a doctor, he recognized the signs of someone under extreme psychological stress. As a son, he sensed something unspoken lurking behind his mother's forced composure. When Finn tried to confront Lee gently, she deflected, hiding behind exhaustion and professional pressure. The lie tasted bitter, but she could not risk the truth. Steffi, however, was less easily dismissed. Her instincts screamed that Sheila was involved, that Lee's fear was not self-generated but imposed. The thought that Sheila might be manipulating someone as controlled and principled as Lee sent a chill through her. If Sheila could bend Lee, then no one was safe. Sheila, sensing hesitation and delay, grew impatient. Control was meaningless without momentum. She began pressing Lee harder, escalating from implication to explicit threat. This time, she named scenarios accidents that could be misinterpreted, situations that would look like tragic coincidence. Finn's safety was no longer an abstract risk, it was an imminent one. Sheila demanded faster results, deeper fractures, no more half measures. Lee felt the walls closing in, her cooperation no longer enough to satisfy Sheila's hunger for dominance. Desperation forced Lee into a dangerous choice. She realized that compliance would never truly protect Finn, only postpone the inevitable. Sheila would always demand more. The only way out was exposure, but exposure carried its own risks. Quietly, Lee reached out to someone she trusted completely, an ally whose loyalty had been proven over time. She spoke carefully, revealing just enough to signal danger without fully incriminating herself. It was a gamble born of terror and maternal instinct, a last attempt to reclaim control over a situation that had spiraled beyond her grasp. The gamble did not go unnoticed. Sheila sensed the shift immediately. Years of manipulation had sharpened her perception to a blade's edge. She confronted Lee with barely restrained fury, accusing her of betrayal, of forgetting who truly held power. The confrontation was chilling in its intimacy to women bound by blood and history standing on opposite sides of an irreversible line. Sheila made it clear that Lee's resistance had consequences and that those consequences would not fall on Lee alone. Lee stood at the edge of collapse. Every instinct screamed to protect Finn, but every path forward seemed to lead to destruction. Submit and become an accomplice to cruelty that would destroy lives. Resist and risk losing her son to a woman who saw people as pieces on a board. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, brutal, and final. In that moment, Lee understood the true nature of Sheila's power. It was not rooted in strength or intelligence, but in her ability to exploit love. And Lee also understood something else: love, when pushed far enough, can become defiance. Whether through exposure, sacrifice, or confrontation, Lee knew she could no longer exist in the space between compliance and resistance. She would have to choose, knowing that whatever decision she made would change her family forever. As the tension tightened and secrets strained to remain hidden, everyone involved stood on the brink of revelation. Sheila's plan, once elegant and invisible, was beginning to fracture under its own cruelty. And Lee Finnegan, a woman who had spent her life believing in order and control, found herself facing the most terrifying truth of all. Sometimes protecting the people you love requires stepping directly into the fire, even if it means being consumed by it. In The Bold and the Beautiful, this was not merely a story about manipulation or revenge. It was a reckoning about choice, loyalty, and the cost of silence. And as Lee stood at the crossroads between submission and resistance, one certainty remained unavoidable: Sheila Carter's war was far from over, and whatever happened next would leave no one untouched. In The Bold and the Beautiful, there are moments when a character does not simply change direction, but detonates the fragile balance holding an entire world together. Hope Logan's decision to walk away from Forrester Creations was not impulsive, nor was it born of rebellion alone. It was the slow, painful result of suffocation, of realizing that what had once been a dream had quietly transformed into a cage, and that the bars of that cage were built from control disguised as devotion. For a long time, Hope tried to convince herself that the discomfort she felt at Hope for the future was temporary, a byproduct of stress, ambition, and the complicated history she shared with Thomas Forrester. She reminded herself of how much the line meant to her, how it had been conceived as a reflection of her values: sustainability, compassion, and empowerment. She told herself that creative tension was normal, that strong partnerships required compromise. Yet with each passing day, the atmosphere around her grew heavier, more constricting, until even walking into the design office felt like stepping into a room where the air had been slowly drained. Thomas's presence was everywhere, not loud or overt, but constant and invasive. He framed his involvement as support, his opinions as protection, his influence as necessity. Decisions that once belonged to Hope alone began to arrive prepackaged with explanations of why his way was safer, smarter, more strategic. He watched closely, anticipated her needs before she voiced them, corrected her instincts with unsettling confidence. To outsiders, it looked like collaboration. To Hope, it felt like erasure. The most terrifying realization was not that Thomas was manipulating her, but that he genuinely believed he was doing what was best for her, and that belief made him relentless. The line between professional pressure and emotional control blurred until Hope could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Every disagreement was reframed as instability on her part. Every attempt to assert independence was met with concern thinly veiled as care. Thomas did not raise his voice or issue ultimatums. He simply tightened the perimeter around her choices until there were none left that did not pass through him. Hope began to doubt herself, to second-guess ideas she once believed in with conviction. The creative joy that had fueled hope for the future drained away, replaced by anxiety and exhaustion. Leaving Forrester Creations felt unthinkable at first. It was not just a job, it was family, history, and legacy intertwined. Hope had grown up in the shadow of that building, had fought to carve out space within it that reflected who she was rather than who others expected her to be. Walking away felt like surrender, like letting Thomas win, but staying began to feel like something worse, like losing herself entirely. The turning point came quietly, without drama. It was a late evening, the office nearly empty, when Hope realized she was afraid to voice a design idea she loved. Afraid not of criticism, but of being talked out of her own vision before it had a chance to breathe. That fear landed with devastating clarity. Hope understood then that no amount of success could justify living in a state of constant self-censorship. Control, even when wrapped in familiarity, was still control. And love, whether professional or personal, could not exist where autonomy was systematically dismantled. Around that same time, an unexpected invitation arrived from Katie Logan Spencer. Logan Fashion House, still in its formative stages, was positioning itself as an alternative to the entrenched power structures of the fashion world. Katie's vision was bold but grounded, ambitious without being predatory. She spoke to Hope not as a subordinate or a symbol, but as an equal. The offer was not framed as rescue, but as opportunity, a chance to build something new without the weight of Forrester politics pressing down on every creative decision. Alongside Katie was Deke Sharp, whose presence complicated the invitation in ways Hope could not ignore. Deke represented a different kind of intensity than Thomas. Where Thomas controlled through strategy and emotional leverage, Deke moved through raw honesty and unapologetic desire. He did not pretend to know what was best for Hope. He challenged her, admired her, and made it clear that her independence was what drew him in. That clarity was both disarming and dangerous. Hope did not accept the offer immediately. She agonized over it, weighing loyalty against survival, history against possibility. She knew what her departure would mean not just professionally, but symbolically. Hope for the future had been one of Forrester's most visible commitments to ethical fashion. Her exit would be interpreted as rejection, not only of Thomas, but of the entire Forrester legacy. And yet, the idea of staying felt like choosing comfort over truth. When Hope finally resigned, the impact was seismic. The announcement rippled through Forrester Creations like a shock wave, leaving disbelief and anger in its wake. Thomas was blindsided, not because he had not sensed Hope pulling away, but because he had believed deeply and dangerously that she would never actually leave. Her departure struck at the core of his identity. Hope was not just a partner, she was proof of his redemption, his tether to legitimacy. Losing her meant losing control over the narrative he had built around himself. Thomas's reaction was a volatile mix of heartbreak, fury, and denial. He framed Hope's decision as manipulation by outsiders, refusing to accept that her choice was autonomous. In his mind, Katie and Deke had exploited her vulnerability, lured her away at a moment of weakness. This belief allowed him to avoid confronting the truth that his need to possess had driven Hope away. Rather than reflect, Thomas doubled down, convinced that reclaiming Hope professionally or personally was not only justified, but necessary. At Logan Fashion House, Hope experienced a kind of freedom that felt almost surreal. Ideas were debated rather than dictated. Creative risks were encouraged rather than contained. Katie trusted Hope's instincts implicitly, valuing her perspective as integral to the brand's identity. The environment was demanding, but it was honest. For the first time in a long while, Hope felt energized rather than depleted by her work. Yet that freedom came at a cost. The distance from Forrester Creations did not erase Thomas's presence from her life. If anything, it intensified it. Dek's role in Hope's new chapter quickly became impossible to ignore. His attraction to Hope was evident, charged with a tension that neither of them fully addressed at first. He admired her strength, her refusal to be owned or defined by anyone else. At the same time, Deke was not immune to jealousy. Thomas loomed large as both rival and reminder of Hope's past. The dynamic between the three of them began to crystallize into something volatile, a triangle built on desire, control, and unresolved history. Thomas watched from the outside, his sense of loss mutating into obsession. He interpreted every success Hope achieved at Logan Fashion House as theft not just of talent, but of identity. The idea that Hope could thrive without him was intolerable. He inserted himself wherever possible, offering unsolicited advice, making public comments about Hope for the future as if it still belonged to him. Each move was calculated to remind Hope that she could never fully escape his orbit. Hope, caught between Thomas's relentless presence and Dek's growing intensity, found herself navigating a new kind of conflict. Deke wanted honesty, passion, and commitment. Thomas wanted restoration, control, and absolution. And Hope wanted something she had never fully allowed herself before, the right to choose without being punished for it. The triangle was not just romantic, it was ideological. Each man represented a different version of her future and a different interpretation of who she was allowed to be. As the rivalry escalated, the fashion world took notice. Logan Fashion House became more than a new label, it became a statement. Hope's involvement elevated its profile, signaling a shift in creative power away from Forrester Creations. Investors whispered, buyers watched closely. The industry sensed that something fundamental was changing and that change had Hope Logan at its center. Forrester Creations, once unassailable, now faced competition not just from outside, but from someone who knew its strengths and weaknesses intimately. Emotionally, Hope stood at the most precarious point of her life. She had reclaimed her voice, but at the cost of peace. She had escaped control, but not consequence. Every step forward required confronting the echoes of the past, the guilt of leaving, and the fear of repeating old patterns. The question that haunted her was not who she loved, but who she would become if she allowed herself to choose freely. In the end, Hope's departure from Forrester Creations was not a rejection of family or legacy. It was an assertion of selfhood in a world that had long tried to define her through others. The triangle between Hope, Thomas, and Deke was not a scandal, it was a collision of philosophies about love, power, and autonomy. And as Logan Fashion House rose in prominence, one truth became increasingly clear. Hope Logan was no longer a symbol to be controlled or protected. She was a force in her own right. In the bold and the beautiful, such transformations never end cleanly. They provoke backlash, obsession, and desire in equal measure. Hope's choice did not bring immediate happiness or resolution. It brought conflict, uncertainty, and risk. But it also brought something far more dangerous to those who sought to own her freedom.